I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. This is our regular meeting of Town Council, January 8th, 2018. I wanted you all to have the opportunity to be the best dressed in the room this evening, so I decided to dress myself as far down as possible, so this will be your one chance to look better than me. I'm speaking for the men, of course. All right, moving on. All members of council are present. The selectman is also present. Are there any comments to our quite lengthy consent calendar? All right, seeing none, I will pass the consent calendar in its entirety. Communications, we have A through W, and thankfully I don't have to read those any longer, so I would just ask that our clerk incorporate those communications as set forth on our agenda into the minutes of this meeting. Moving on to public participation. Are there any members of the public who wish to participate publicly at this time? All right, seeing none, I'm going to close the first public participation. We have 3 appointments this evening. Starting with A is Bruno Maini to Planning and Zoning Commission. Mr. Rooney?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Due to the personal relationship with Mr. Maini, I'd like to refer to that to Dennis Condon to make that motion, please.
I'd like to make that motion.
Sure.
To make him in planning and zoning. Right?
A motion by Mr. Condon to appoint Bruno Maini to the Planning and Zoning Commission. Is there a second?
I'll second it.
Second by Ms. Lapellis.
Fill the vacancy by David
Yeah.
Townsend.
Is there a term ending?
What's the term?
Do you have that?
That's what I said together.
Well, it's an elected position, so the term is going to end, if not sooner, it's going to be subject to re-election at the next
November
municipal
27th.
election. Right,
So 2019.
2019. Mr. Condon, do you have the, I'm sorry,
When was Townsend elected? Did he just-
do we have the details on when date Mr. Townsend was elected for discussion purposes?
April 17th.
Do we have that?
Did he run this last time?
April 17th.
He had a 4-year term.
Did he run this last election?
No, he did not. He had a
He did not.
4-year term.
So it'll be
Then it's
2019.
19.
Yeah, 2019.
19, okay,
Yeah.
so 19. All right. For discussion, Mr. Condon?
I was a 14-year resident of town. We know him as parent of 2 children. We attend Jockey Hollow and Monroe L. His family has also got a history of community involvement and currently serves as coach director of AYSO soccer and is an umpire for the Monroe Little League. So,
All right, thank you, Mr. Condon. Are there any further comments or discussion? Mr. Rooney, just want to note for the record, Mr. Rooney is recusing himself from this vote due to his business relationship with Mr. Miney. Any further? All right, I'll call for a vote. All those in favor? And against? The motion carries 8-0 with 1 abstention. Moving on to item B is Ryan Condon to the, actually, may I have a motion to, we need to amend the agenda. Is there a motion to amend the agenda as to appointments B? The appointment of Ryan Condon should be to the Planning and Zoning Commission as an alternate.
So moved.
Motion by Ms. Lapellis. Is there a second? Second by Mr. Reed. Just the motion is to correct a Scrivener's error on the agenda. Any further discussion? All those in favor of the motion to amend? All right, motion carries.
recuse. Frank, that was a recusal. Sorry.
Okay, 8-0, recusal by Mr. Condon, who is the father of Ryan Condon, Mr. Junior Ryan Condon. All right, 8-0. All right, so the appointment is to the Planning and Zoning Commission as an alternate?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
I'll second it.
Second by Ms. Lapellis. Discussion? Who made the motion? Anybody make the motion?
Mr. Chairman just made the motion to change it, so
Okay.
we need to
All right,
make
so
a
I
motion.
need
to
a
appoint him.
motion for the appointment.
I'll make a motion to.
Motion by
to-
Mr. Pellis, thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Mr. Mauer. Discussion, Mr. Rooney.
Yeah, Mr. Condon is a lifelong resident of Monroe and a graduate of Monroe School System. He holds a bachelor's degree from Hofstra University in Film History and Production. He works full-time for a medical device company, serves as a volunteer with Monroe EMS, has been on the Zoning Board of Appeals. This position will replace the vacancy left by Bruno Marini, and it will have a term ending November 27th, 19.
Right, thank you, Mr. Rooney. Before we proceed, our rules of procedure require that our legislative and administrative subcommittee interview all midterm elected positions, candidates for elected, appointment to elected positions as a condition precedent to town council considering the individuals. For the record, both Mr. Maini and Mr. Condon did come as scheduled to appear before LNA. They were interviewed by LNA. Mr. Maini, as you'll hear in the LNA report, Mr. Maini was approved by LNA. Mr. Condon, due to the LNA meeting being a special meeting and due to the agenda referencing his appointment to the Zoning Board of Appeals as opposed to the Planning and Zoning Commission, and it being a special meeting, we could not amend the agenda, so we did not take action in LNA this evening on Mr. Condon's appointment, so the condition precedent pursuant to our rules and procedure was not technically followed because of the error on the agenda. So I would ask just to table the motion pending our vote of the council to waive our rule of procedure that requires town council to interview midterm elected positions in LNA. And again, just for the record, technically, he was interviewed, technically, and the three members of LNA can vouch for this, but I don't think anybody had any issues. I didn't hear any objections or anything to this appointment. So it's for purposes of keeping in compliance with our rules of procedure, I would just ask for a motion to waive the rule of procedure as it regards to this appointment.
So moved.
Motion by Mr. Reed, second by Ms. Lapellis. Any discussion?
Didn't we have a motion on the floor?
We did. I tabled it.
Okay.
Any discussion? No. All right, no discussion. So all those in favor of the motion to waive the rule of procedure that LNA interview Ryan Condon prior to this appointment? And against? Motion carries 8-0 with Mr. Condon abstaining. Do I have a motion to pull from the table and reconsider the motion that we previously were considering to appoint Ryan Condon?
So moved.
Motion by Mr. Mauer, is there a second?
I'll second it.
Second by Mr. Rooney. All those in favor? Motion carries 9-0. All right, so we have, I'm sorry, 8-0, thank you. 801. The motion before council is for the appointment of Ryan Condon to the Planning and Zoning Commission as an alternate. Any further discussion? No. All right, all those in favor? And again, so we're back in law school or something like this, isn't it? Still on appointments. C, Chris Thornley to Board of Health. Mr. Rooney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to make a motion to appoint Christopher Thornley Jr. of 36 Chalk Hill Road to the Board of Health for a term ending April 27, 21. That appointment will fill the vacancy left by ours truly, Dennis Condon.
Motion by Mr. Rooney. Is there a second? Second by Ms. Lapellis. Discussion. Mr. Rooney.
Christopher Thornley Jr. is a 17-year resident of Monroe and has several children in the Monroe school system, previously a small businessman where he ran several small businesses. He currently works as an operating room nurse. Because of his diverse background, he has the skills necessary to work collaboratively with others and be an asset to the Board of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Rooney. Any further discussion? All those in favor? Motion carries 9-0. I feel like we're back on track. All right, moving on to action items. A is the Town Council Committee on Finance, Education, Health, and Public Safety. Has that body met?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, that body has met.
Mr. Rooney?
Yes, sir. The body has met. We selected, we did the nominations for chair and secretary. So I'm fortunate enough to be chairing that committee. And I have a small report. In regards to finance, finance has not met through the holidays according to our liaison. Mr. Mauer is liaison to finance. The Commission on Aging also, we have nothing to report. On education, there's a budget scenario of a 1.84% increase. 80% of that is contractual for employee contracts. And the Board of Health, they're preparing the budget and they're working through the impact of, they have some new bylaws with local restaurants, new state health department changes. So they're working on that in regards to cold food handling, warm food handling. Some of those temperatures have changed, and so they're going to be bringing the restaurants up to speed with that. In regards to EMS, I have a good handle on what's going on to that, but I'd like to refer that to Councilman Condon if I could, because he's better versed in that area.
Sure.
If you don't mind, Mr.
Please,
Chairman.
please.
Thank you.
Well, there's a lot going on in EMS. Clearly, they're working on the budget for the town. They also have a response for the RFP for the ambulance. They've received that, and unfortunately, it's over what's been budgeted. So they've broken into like a subcommittee to reevaluate the RFP. There's only one response to the RFP. Actually, 2 people responded to the RFP, only one submitted a bid. So one bid was significantly over what the budget is. So they're working through that process to see if they either go for another RFP or work on the difference which mainly became one of, all our ambulances were retrofitted with stretchers, automated stretchers over the years. That difference was about $40,000. So when you put out the bid for this ambulance, it came with a full ambulance, including the stretchers. So that made it a $40,000 expense difference. And also, it also was like $4,000 over that. So they've broken into a subcommittee. They will be reporting back as to what they want to do, whether they're going to go back to another RFP, put it out again, or whether they can adjust what's going on. There are significant, changes in the industry, and ambulances are built many different ways. So they're looking into it, and they should be able to report back next meeting.
Thank you, Mr. Condon. Mr. Rooney, is that it for your report?
Yes, in regards to fire, I spoke to Bill Davin briefly. Of course, they're working on the fire study. I believe they have some guests coming on February 9th and February 10th to
Chiefs
speak
are here.
of
We
that.
had a meeting to discuss it. State notification today, so they should be here for on-site investigation, or on-site surveys, February 8th through 10th is the targeted dates at this point. So it's moving right along. We have the list of questions, and the chiefs have that, and they're filling out their survey data now. So it's moving along.
Mr. Chairman, in regards to police, we had a recent resignation, which creates one more staff opening in the PD. The police department has secured 2 spots in April at the Police Officer Standard and Training Academy, Post Academy, State Police Barracks in Meriden. So they're currently doing background investigations and hoping to fill both seats for the April 3rd start date for the academy class. And that's all I have to report.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank you,
Rooney.
Mr. Chair.
Moving on to action item B is the Town Council Committee on Planning and Zoning, Public Works, and Park and Recreation Matters. Mr. Bellis?
Yeah, one meeting was canceled because of the snow last week. The other meeting, they had an election of officers. William Porter will stay on as chair, Michael O'Reilly is the vice chair, and secretary is Paul Lisi. And then they approved the change to the site plan for the NBC Sports property and approved changes to property relating to a small law office moving back to Monroe. And then for Park and Rec, the meeting was tonight because it was canceled last Thursday, and the December meeting was canceled due to a lack of quorum. That's it for me.
Thank you, Ms. LaPellis. Moving on to action item C is the Town Council Committee on Legislative and Administrative Matters. Mr. Reed?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We just met at 7:30. It was our first meeting since the appointments back in December. The subcommittee has voted me as chairman, so I have taken on the chair for that. And as you just saw, we had 2 interviews, Bruno and Ryan, and they came in and we know the results of that. We do have 4 pieces on the agenda that we are bringing in the new items, new business tonight: WMNR lease extension agreement, WMNR 2018 CPB grant, the metal management scrap acceptance, and Cohen and Wolf retainer, all of which are new business items, which will provide our guidance and consensus at that time.
Thank you, Mr. Reed.
Yep.
Moving on to item D is Strategic Planning Committee. That subcommittee has not met. EMS Facility Work Group, also that subcommittee has not met, to be replaced by the Building Committee hopefully soon. And item F is the First Selectmen's update. Mr. Kellogg?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Actually, I will pass down a one-pager for you. There's 3 quick items I wanted to go over from follow-ups from prior meetings. One was in regards to the proposed cell tower from AT&T that we discussed a couple of times. We did hold a meeting with AT&T as well as their representatives, as well as staff, to discuss their proposal as it relates to the EMS feasibility, the facility feasibility study, and that coupled with our desire to get more input, not just from EMS, but also from the Monroe Fire, which currently utilizes that facility, and get some additional collaboration and communication with them. So the project team is very willing to collaborate with an anticipated new EMS building committee. So that is something they are ready to engage with. So I think that would be very helpful. They are confident that different options could be formulated in consultation with that committee so that they could accomplish both things. I also expressed a desire that I wanted to get further input from the community as well prior to this proceeding to an 824, and they've agreed to establish some public information sessions regarding any of the proposals or different options for proposal of that tower prior to, they would be willing to do that prior to you entertaining a subsequent 824 referral to planning and zoning. So at that point, that's kind of where I'd like to proceed, unless anyone has any concerns. It gives us some time. In the meantime, the existing cow is still, they get recurring approvals from FCC for that. So on the multi-use trail project, this is something that came up several months ago. I know some of the council members are new and weren't here when that was first presented. You may remember some time ago, Mr. Schatzline had presented to this council the desire to go out and obtain some quotes for that project. This was a project that was funded through a LOTSIP grant and a commitment letter for $1.5 million, but the town having to foot the bill for the design work of that. Then the capital budget was put in for $100,000 with the intent of seeing where the project would come in once quotes had been sent out. Mr. Schatzline did obtain the quotes as it was authorized by the council. The current estimate is over $200,000, so it is more than we have allocated currently. However, a much larger concern that I have currently is that we've been advised through MetroCog that the LOTSIP grant likely will be changing due to the state budget issues. So the expectation is that the LOTSIP grant is probably going to transition into a different form of a grant program, probably one that will require, it could morph into a couple of different ways, but the concern is that with our project, the status it's at, while we would only be able to proceed if construction was advertised by June 30th and have it fully state funded. That is not practical for this project. There's not sufficient time to create sufficient bid documents and get that project out. Furthermore, the other concern is that if it does migrate to a federal program, there's a reasonable concern that matching funds from the town would be required. It's not clear as to whether or not the design work that we will have done and paid for would count towards that match, and if so, how much it would count towards that match. So, given the high degree of uncertainty at this point, my thought, and MetroCog was in full agreement, was that we should kind of hold off on taking any further action and committing any further town funds until we get some clarity around the LOTSIP grant and what's going to happen there. And for those of you not familiar, MetroCog is the required regional agency that works with the state DOT to manage those grants in our COG. So it's, MetroCog is intimately involved in this process, so they are very familiar with what's going on. So that said, my recommendation would be to hold on that at this point, but I just want to let you know where it stood. Last is the TPA design group agreement for the Wolf Park field construction. This was a contract for $18,500 that would have been funded through the current balance from previous appropriations through both the Wilton Fund and some prior bonding. If you remember in a previous conversation, there was additional research that I wanted to do. We've done some of those reviews of past contracts, the current proposed contract, as well as some further discussions with staff. And I still have some remaining concerns regarding the current scope of work relative to work that would have been included in the prior agreement, and trying to understand where that flushes out. So at this point, the next step that I am looking to do is to actually have a meeting with TPA to go over those issues and see where that all flushes out. So until we get to that point, I'd like to hold off, asking for your consent to, authorize any further contractual awards until we have that meeting and flush that item out as well. My only other update is in regards to the bond authorizations that are on your agenda, and I can wait until you're at that point in the agenda to go over that.
Thank you, Mr. Kellogg. Ms. Martin?
Mr. Kellogg,
Yes.
I think our meeting the end of November, you had suggested that you would have the people from AT&T come and talk to the council.
There was a discussion at a council meeting where I believe it was asked, I think through the prior subcommittee, if they would invite AT&T to the council, which they had agreed to, but I had actually asked this council, I think in perhaps the first or maybe second meeting after we were all, the inauguration, to hold off on that until I could understand where this agreement stood, where this project stood relative to what they were trying to do.
Right.
Plus the other issue came up relative to the EMS building, et cetera. So,
Would you anticipate in the future having them come once things are ironed out a bit, or?
Well, again, what I'd like to see is them do some further analysis again relative to the plans there for the EMS facility. And then, certainly if the council would like to be briefed prior to having that public information session, council meetings are public anyway, so it could be done together, or if you prefer to have a subcommittee get a preview, if you will, I'd be happy to arrange that, and no concerns, whatever works. Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Martin. Thank you, Mr. Kellogg. And Mr. Kellogg, I just want to commend you and thank you for your written update. It makes it very easy to follow along, so I appreciate that very much. I hope to see more of that in the future. Before we move on to unfinished business, I just wanted to just correct our parliamentary procedure. I was conferring with Mr. Robert about my using chairman's discretion to table the pending motion, and I don't believe I had that authority. I believe it had to be a motion to table, so the waiver, the action that we took while the motion was pending, I would deem to be invalid, so just that we do things properly. I just would like to have a motion to waive our rule of procedure that requires Mr. Condon to have been interviewed by L&A. I think we can do it now. I think the
Is it
motion to
retroactive?
approve him was appropriate, but I think that motion being considered while the other motion was pending was probably not appropriate, and it wasn't appropriately voted on by council, so if we could redo that motion unless there's any objection or comment from anybody else who wants to be the parliamentarian for the time being. Madam Clerk?
Someone, let me see, who was it? Mr. Mauer made a motion to pull it from, Mr. Reed made a motion to waive the rule of procedure, and Ms. Thank you, Capellas made the second. You guys passed it, 8-0 with one abstention, and the abstention was Mr. Condon, and Mr. Mauer made a motion to pull it back from the table, and the second was Mr. Rooney, and it was 8-0.
Right, thank you. But it was never on the table properly, so
Oh, I'm sorry.
that was the
I thought
issue.
it was.
It wasn't on the table properly, and it not being on the table properly, the motion to take off the table wasn't necessary, and then the waiver being voted on while the other motion to appoint was pending was probably also not appropriate. Mr. Mauer?
I move to waive the rule of order requiring us to have tabled the motion to appoint Ryan Condon earlier in this meeting, as to, in effect, make the motion to waive the make the motion to waive the requirement of the interview appropriate.
I still think that's.
I think, I appreciate that motion, and it's subject to being second because you're making a motion, but I think all we have to do is vote on the waiver of the rules of procedure, because I think anything that was done while the motion was pending was inappropriate. That's what I think. I appreciate the motion,
I
but
just have one last good one.
there's a motion pending, so either second or withdrawal, just.
Withdraw.
I'll second it.
All right, with motion's withdrawn.
Oh.
Beat you to the gun, all right.
All right.
Any other comments?
I just have one.
Yes.
As long as that motion doesn't need another motion to validate what we voted on afterwards. So it's retrospect, plus it then validates anything afterwards,
Yeah,
correct?
I just think we need to waive our rules of procedure. I guess the question is, do we have to waive the rules of procedure before we consider it a vote?
That's actually that's my point.
Why don't we do this? Miss, would you entertain withdrawing your motion?
Certainly.
Yeah,
All right, since it was inappropriate, the vote, we can consider the vote to be inappropriate. We'll vote on a waiver again,
Yes.
we'll re-vote. Is everybody okay with that?
that's what I think we have to do, yeah.
I've been doing this kind of not that long of a time, but I don't think we've had such a circus.
This is good, though, we're getting it.
This is actually, this is actually fun.
Yeah, I like it.
I feel like I'm the Kirby enthusiasm episode. All right, so is there a motion to waive the rule of procedure that requires LMA to have interviewed Ryan Condon?
So,
Motion by Mr. Reed. Discussion?
now we're good.
All those in favor?
We're getting there.
All right. 8-0 to 1. Is there a motion to appoint Ryan Condon to the Planning and Zoning Commission as an alternate?
So moved.
Motion by Mr. Mauer, second by Ms. Lapellis. We've already heard the discussion. Is there any further need for discussion regarding this appointment? All right, seeing none, call for a vote. All those in favor? Against, motion 8-0 to 1 with Mr. Condon abstaining. Do you think we've covered it now?
Yep.
Speak now or forever hold your peace?
Nope.
All right, we're all on video. All right, moving on to unfinished business. Thank you very much. Jocular updates. Mr. Kellogg, if there are no updates from you, we will move on unless there's questions from the council. Status quo?
No updates?
Any questions, comments? No? Okay, moving on to the fire study. Again, probably shouldn't be there. Anything further to report on the fire study, Mr. Kellogg?
You know, other than the committee did, I think Mr. Condon referenced this, the committee did have a special meeting to, basically the selected vendor wanted to basically hold a kind of a first meeting to understand what data they needed to collect and start parsing out how that would be accomplished. So that was done. Mr. Fire Marshal Davin is on point, coordinating it on the town side and the fire side. And as they said, they're scheduling their meetings to start coming in here and start engaging and asking questions and doing the research.
Great.
So it's underway.
Thank you very much. Any questions or comments? All right, move on to new business. A is the Webb Mountain Discovery Zone donation. Mr. Pellis?
I'll make a motion to accept the donation to Webb Mountain's Discovery Zone in the amount of $14,000.
Motion by Mr. Pellis, is there a second?
Second.
Second by Mr. Mauer. You have in your packet the information relative to the donation. As you know, any donations to the town that exceed typically $5,000, we pull off the consent calendar and vote on them for nothing other than to make sure the council is fully aware of the magnitude of the donation and to give a little bit more attention to such a generous donation. Any further discussion, comment? All right, seeing none, I'll call for a vote. All those in favor? And against, motion carries 9-0. Moving on to B, the Project Warmth donations. Mr. Pellis?
I make a motion to accept the Project Warmth donations.
Motion by Mr. Pellis. Is there a second by Mr. Condon? Ditto to what I said previously. Any further discussion or comment? All right, seeing none, I'll call for a vote. All those in favor? And against, motion carries 9-0. I'd like to personally thank on behalf of council all the donors that we just voted on for their generous donations. Moving on to new business C is the 2017 Emergency Management Performance Grant Resolution. Mr. Pellis?
I make a motion to accept the FFY 2017 Emergency Management Performance Grant. Resolved that the town of Monroe may enter into with and deliver to the state of Connecticut Department of Emergency Services and Public Protection, Division of Emergency Management and Homeland Security, any and all documents which it deems to be necessary or appropriate pertaining to the FFY 2017 Emergency Management Performance Grant. Further resolved that Kenneth M. Kellogg, as first selectman of the town of Monroe, is authorized and directed to execute and deliver any and all documents on behalf of the town of Monroe, and to do and perform all acts and things which he deems to be necessary or appropriate to carry out the terms of such documents, including but not limited to executing and delivering all agreements and documents contemplated by such documents.
Motion by Ms. Lapellis, which states the resolution as presented. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Ms. Martin. For discussion, and Mr. Kellogg, do you have anything to add?
Absolutely, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I did, there's a brief memo here as well to explain this. So this grant was approved by this council on November 13th. And it was subsequently executed. The grant agreement was executed by Mr. Vavrick. We were informed by the state of Connecticut that they would prefer to have it, have a new resolution authorizing me and having a new signatory on this because it will make their life much easier in dealing with the federal agencies and other state agencies that have to process it. And it certainly seemed to be a reasonable request, and that's why it's before you.
Thank you, Mr. Kellogg. Any further discussion? All right, seeing none, I'll call for a vote. All those in favor? And against, that motion carries 9-0. Moving on to new business, item D is the EMS Building Committee Resolution. Mr. Pellis?
I make a motion to accept the EMS Building Committee Resolution and authorize the first selectman to execute it on behalf of the town of Monroe.
Second.
Motion by Mr. Pellis, second by Mr. Rooney. For discussion, again, I'll defer to Mr. Kellogg.
So this is a resolution that had been working its way through subcommittee for some time. Several months ago, it went to LNA. It received comments from the town attorney at the time. Those have been incorporated with, as well as other things that came up in various discussions over time. So this has been kind of ripe for a while. I know there was some back and forth from the different, in terms of people making suggestions relative to the makeup of the committee. Those seem to be resolved. So it is, I believe it is now ripe for your consideration, and something that we've been trying to get underway for quite some time, as you know. So I'd like to move this forward.
Thank you, Mr. Kellogg. Any questions, comments for the discussion? Ms. Aguilar.
Mr. Chairman. Mr. Kellogg, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Kellogg, with this committee being, if it is approved tonight, the grant that we got a couple years ago, then that will make that grant viable. Then we can go ahead with that grant, right?
Well, we took action, I don't know how many months ago that was, while I was on council at the time,
Yeah.
to authorize the first selectman to enter into the memorandum of understanding with the state of Connecticut to get that steep grant moving forward. That was done. I know Mr. Vavrick executed that. I actually worked with Mr. Banowski and Mr. Vavrick to get that entire MOU package up to the state. That went up to them quite some time ago. It is still with them. But certainly, yes, I mean, they look for these things to be progressing to continue to make those grants viable. So because it's still at the state, this will certainly help that process along, should the state be getting any kind of ideas in regard to that grant.
Okay.
But I've heard nothing other than it's still in process.
Okay, and that grant, did it have an expiration?
The MOU is a 2-year agreement from the date it's executed. So that's, you'll see in this resolution, that's why we put a 2-year window on the
Okay.
actual project. Not, it is not uncommon for steep grants to request and easily obtain extensions to that, as long as you're showing progress, if that were to arise. But the standard is, it's a 2-year from the time the MOU is executed.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Get to sing and dance now, Mr. Condon.
Over to.
Is that all, Ms. Aguilar?
That's it, thank you,
Okay.
Mr.
Any
Chairman.
further comments or discussions regarding this resolution? I can just personally say, I just want to thank you, Mr. Kellogg, and for all the subcommittees who did put a lot of work into this process. It's certainly been a long time coming. I'm excited to amend our agenda formally to remove one of the work groups and replace it with this building facility and see this project continue down the path that
And
we have had for so long. Yes.
thank you. And, Mr. Lita, it dawned on me, and perhaps for your next meeting, unless you want to add it to the agenda, it would probably be appropriate to formally dissolve the EMS facility work group.
Correct.
So
We'll add
you-
that to the next agenda and
I
we'll
will
get that
add
going.
I will make a note to it.
Okay. Would it be appropriate, Mr. Kelly, I'm not sure if you have the information before you, just to reapprise council and the public as to the members that have been appointed to that committee?
Right, so is the makeup of the 7-member committee, which is representative from town council, Mr. Rooney, a former member from the EMS facility work group, Mr. Michael Vitello, representative from the Board of Finance, Mr. Let's say John O, because I know I'll probably mess up his last name.
Ostraszewski.
Thank you, Ms. Martin. I didn't want to attempt it. I always
It's
mess
a
it up.
toughie.
Another individual who is on the former EMS facility work group, Mr. Dominic Benicia, the current chairman of the EMS commission, and another individual who was on the EMS facility work group, Mr. John Brenna. Sorry?
Who's he?
Oh, I'm sorry, who's here tonight? Mr. Salvatore Morabito, who is on the Building Board of Appeals, but has extensive experience in projects such as these, and Mr. Robert Westland, who is on the Economic Development Commission.
Thank you, Mr. Kellogg, Mr. Brenna, and fellow volunteers. Just want to extend our gratitude and thanks for serving on this committee, and we hope your work will see through this project that we've been working so hard on behalf of the town. So thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Kellogg. Any further comments or discussion? All right, seeing none, call for a vote. All those in favor? And against, the motion carries 9-0. Moving on to new business, item E is the WMNR lease agreement extension. Ms. LaPellis?
I make a motion to accept the WMNR lease agreement extension. It's a lease agreement for commercial space rented at 731 Main Street, which expires on April 30th, 2018, with a 90-day right to extend the agreement for another 5 years.
Motion by Mr. Pellis, is there a second?
Second.
Second by Ms. Martin. For purposes of discussion, we do have a memorandum from Mr. Kellogg in our packet. This agreement was we also have a company memorandum, a letter of opinion from the town attorney, Attorney Hayden, along with a copy of correspondence from WMNR. I understand. LNA did review the particulars of this and did approve for council's consideration this extension 3-0. I know Mr. Anderson is present this evening, and Mr. Kellogg, I'm not sure if you want to comment first, so I'll turn the floor over to you first, and then
Thank you.
Mr. Anderson. Mr. Kellogg?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So if you look, perhaps, I think it's 4 pages into the package of this, you'll see a letter. It's a draft letter dated January 9th, 2018, on my letterhead to 731 Main Street LLC, care of Howard Safran. That is essentially what I'm asking you to entertain tonight. It is that letter to allow me to send notice to the current landlord to exercise our right to extend the current lease agreement. So should you approve this tonight, there will be a subsequent actual lease agreement that will also come back before you. I don't want you to think that this, so just to frame that, but this is the first part that we need to do, and certainly since by doing this we're making a representation, I think it's appropriate to come before you. Essentially, and I'll let Mr. Anderson speak to this, but essentially this is the lease that is in place that both M&R and the M&R Commission have advocated that we continue to extend. And you'll notice from the analysis that we believe that you know, certainly any move of WM&R would be relatively cost prohibitive relative to the small increase that is contained in the lease agreement, subject to consumer price index. So, and I know Mr. Anderson can talk about this further, but these costs are fully anticipated and incorporated into their operating budget as well. So there are no budgetary concerns. So with that, I'd be happy to defer to you.
Thank you, Mr. Kellogg. Mr. Anderson?
One thing I realized that I forgot to mention in all the many pages of memorandum, this is particularly true for the new town council members, WMNR is a special revenue fund of the town. So the monies that we're asking you to approve to spend for WMNR doesn't come out of tax dollars, it comes out of the monies that are donated to WMNR. So I realized that 30,000 foot overview was missing in all of this. But it does make a difference when you make a vote, to know that.
Great. Thank you very much. Mr. Anderson, any questions? Mr. Reed?
Probably just appropriate at this point. This did go through LNA.
It did.
And we did vote on it. It's a typical year thing that comes in front of us with Mr. Anderson, so it did pass on.
Thank you, Mr. Reed. Any further comments or questions? Mr. Anderson, just the obvious question. Obviously, WMNR itself has considered its options and believes that this serves as the best course of conduct for the station itself.
Yes, we did.
Okay. Anything further? All right, seeing no further comments or requests for discussion, I'll call for a vote. All those in favor? And against? That motion carries 9-0. Moving on to item F is WMNR's 2018 CPB grant. Ms. LaPellis?
I make a motion to accept the 2018 WMNR CPB grant agreement. Resolved that the 2018 Radio Community Service Grant Agreement and Certification of Eligibility dated October 1st, 2017, by and between the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and the Town of Monroe and WMNR are hereby approved, and that the first selectman and general manager of WMNR FM are authorized to execute the agreement on behalf of the Town of Monroe as licensee and WMNR FM as grantee respectively.
Motion by resolution by Ms. LaPellis. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Mr. Mauer. For discussion purposes, we get to see Mr. Anderson at least once per year, if not more, to consider this grant, and this is the annual grant. With that, Mr. Anderson, I'll turn it over to you if you want to add anything to the motion that's before us.
Just as a little, again, big background, this is comes from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which is best described as a private corporation funded by the American people. It receives about $400 million a year from the federal government, a little bit from private foundations, but mostly federal government. Of that, 3/4 goes to public TV, 1/4 goes to public radio, and it did get funded this year in this year's governmental budget. And how should I put it? We had to go through this before when the government got shut down around October 1 a few years ago, but they've got the money. There's no problem about the federal budget ongoing, so we can get the money if the grant's approved.
Great. Ms. LaPaz?
I just wanted to say, it's an excellent program all the years, and I have friends who listen to it from Long Island.
Mr. Reed?
I agree, excellent programming. This did, also appropriate time to say, this did go through LNA, we did discuss it. It did pass, and we want to provide council for a recommendation. We did have one question, though, that I think it's probably appropriate to bring up right now. And this might be just our own memory loss, but this grant, was this the first time there was a carve-out of 25% for national programming, or has it always been like that?
It's always been like that.
So that's always been in the memorandum for the motion?
Yes, well, the total grant amount generally was just listed there, and this year, the grant motions going through the First Selectman's office are a little more detailed than in the past. And so now it's being specified, in part because it's the only portion of it that could be considered restricted.
Sure. It's good to know.
And, yeah.
Thank you for that. I just hadn't seen that before.
Thank you, Mr. Anderson. Any further questions, Mal?
Just one question, we talked about the fact that there is that carve-out. Just for our knowledge, what does the rest of the grant tend to go to in past years? Where does that money tend to, the part that's not carved out for the nationally syndicated programs, where does the other 75% tend to land for your budget?
It has to be, cannot be spent on employees that are needed in order to qualify for the grant, but it is used for supporting operational expenses. So we use it to pay for the transmitter sites, the rent that we pay for some of the transmitter sites, and that's where most of it goes.
Thank you.
Sure.
Mr. Condon?
One more question. It's probably just pure ignorance of reading your form since it's pretty elaborate. But on the one form, page 4, on 4 of 7, the answer one question is the grantee required by Communications Act to maintain CAB, and the answer is no. And the following question is just confusing to me because it didn't seem like it could be a yes, it should be like a blank. But it may be just form mechanics that you have to fill it out.
Again, which was that?
On page 4, the Community Advisory Board,
Yes.
is grantee required by Communications Act to maintain a cab? That's a no, right?
Correct.
And then the second question, if yes, you don't see how that could be a yes. It's got to be like a blank, or it's just confusing to me.
Well, those people those public radio and TV stations that receive these grants are required to have a community advisory board to advise the nonprofit boards to operate it. The exception being if the station is owned by a governmental entity, of which the town is a governmental entity, then it's not required to have that. So that's why it's a no, it's not required to. In terms of the next one, it could have just been the default click. They have a problem. These forms sometimes need to have a not applicable. They don't always have that.
Okay.
And frankly,
That's
one
fine.
year...
That's what I thought was happening. I just wanted to make sure.
Yeah.
Just confusing.
Any further comments or questions, discussion? Seeing none, I'll call for a vote. All those in favor and against, motion carries 9-0. Thank you, Mr. Anderson. Thank you, Mr. Kellogg. Thank you. Moving on to item G, we have the Sims Metal Management Scrap Acceptance Agreement. Ms. LaFellis?
Motion to accept the Sims Metal Management Scrap Acceptance. The agreement is between the town of Monroe and the Sims Metal Management Scrap Company.
Motion by Ms. LaPellis, is there a second? Second by Mr. Reed. For discussion purposes, you have in your packet a very brief 4-page agreement, if you want to call it that, and the requisite opinion letter recommending its execution by Attorney Hayden. For the record, this was also considered by LNA this evening and passed 3-0. Mr. Kellogg, I'll defer to you quickly if you want to start with this.
Absolutely, thank you. So this is a agreement to allow, so as you know, we offer a bulky waste program here in the town. There is a significant amount of waste that is collected that involves scrap metal. Our current process is to basically screen out refrigerants, hazardous waste, et cetera, from that stream. And then we are left with items that we want to dispose of, and the town wishes to continue being able to take the metal, the scrap metal that has some market value, and get the current market value for those various metals. So this agreement is really to allow us to do that, and what we're basically doing is stating that we will abide by our, we will not dispose of hazardous waste or refrigerants in that when we do that scrap metal exchange. It's a process that Public Works already undertakes and we comply with operationally. So this obviously adds a small amount of revenue back to us, but every little bit helps, and it's certainly better than just getting rid of it at a transfer station. So,
Thank you, Mr. Kellogg. Any questions or comments? Mr. Mallon?
Just one question. In the letter we have from the attorney, I just wanted a clarification. Second paragraph, it's talking about one area of potential risk would be where the town failed in its operational oversight.
right.
That is not stating that we have done so in the past, correct?
No,
It's
we
just
haven't. No, we haven't.
okay, so this has never been an issue. It's just that that could be the one risk if we were to
Correct.
not do what we've been doing.
Correct.
Okay.
I think, just related to that, in LNA, we did ask that question. And, I mean, Mr. Nowacki is here tonight to explain further, but we have the administrative and operational controls in place that dovetail with the requirements. So that question was asked directly.
Any further questions or comments? Mr. O'Rourke?
So when we strip out transportation costs and employee time and et cetera, getting it to Sims Metal scrap agreement, we've still come out ahead.
I would agree, yes, yes. I don't remember the exact number, but it was in the low thousands, I thought, maybe a few $1,000s a year perhaps that we can get. I mean, if you'd like to get some specific numbers, prior years, I can look into it, but it was certainly more than the cost of doing this. Yeah.
Anything further? I just want to thank Mr. Phillips, Mr. Nowacki for your presence at LNA this evening to answer our questions. Anything for, nothing? All right, seeing nothing further, I'm going to call for a vote. All those in favor? All those in favor? By show of your hands, thank you very much. And against, motion carries 9-0. All right, H, I, and J are consideration of 3 bond authorizations, and I believe Mr. Kellogg does have a presentation.
Yep.
So before we consider the motions, why don't we just have you present? I'm assuming you've
Sure.
wrapped them all into one, correct?
Yes, correct.
Okay, so you would proceed, go ahead.
Sure. And I'll
Floor is yours.
hand out, Pat is coming down to you as well. So I want to take the opportunity to just kind of go back to where we started from and first give you some background, particularly for those of you who are new to council. Back in June of last year, there were 5 bond authorizations that were presented by former First Selectman Vavrick to council. These were all projects that were approved during the normal current fiscal year capital budget. So all these projects are in our current budget in the year 1 of the 5-year capital plan. However, at that time, as you recall, there was a high degree of uncertainty relative to the state budget, and it was kind of a consensus that we would hold off at that time. So no action was taken, pending, waiting to see what would happen with the state legislature relative to the budget. Current situation is obviously we have a state budget now, and while there is some degree of uncertainty that still exists, I do believe it is prudent at this time that we should pursue certain capital projects that were approved, that it is prudent. We have enough information at this point that I think we can move forward, and we certainly have to continue to invest in the future of our town. These projects have to come off the table at some point. The other issue we have is that the town is at a point where we need to issue bonds for projects that are currently underway, and we are expending dollars. So the fire apparatus, which was done earlier in the fiscal year, and the Stepney Elementary roof, both obviously are underway. So those bonds actually haven't been issued yet. They need to be issued. And it would make sense to add these additional projects to that same bond issuance, because it will lower the overall bond issuance costs, and it also, we can lock in favorable rates that we have currently. So there were 5 projects that were presented back in June. One was from Stevens Fire Department, certain fire departments' driveways, an ambulance replacement, road paving, and public works dump trucks. And I'll go through each one of them quickly and the recommendation for that. So the first has to do with the Stevenson Fire Department equipment. The original bond request back in June was $254,000. That's was in the budget. It was for vehicles and equipment. I had suggested in speaking with Chief Howe, who is here tonight, we've evaluated that. There are a couple of items that they strongly want to pursue. They are both smaller vehicles that are not part of that larger fire apparatus replacement plan. One is an extremely old utility truck, and the other one is the current chief, the operational needs. The equipment components that were in the original budget are items that they all can be deferred and reevaluated in the next fiscal year. There were no urgent matters in that regard. So the recommendation is to reduce that bond authorization request from $254,000 to $132,000. The second item is driveway paving, and you'll see that the actual recommendation is to take this off the table currently. There were 3 fire stations that were in play in the capital budget to have their driveways assessed. The first one is Monroe Station 1. That is the volunteer-owned station at 110. That does need to be addressed. However, as you know, we have a fire study that's underway. We also have some work that intersects with the EMS facility work group. So at this point, it would seem illogical to start repairing the driveway when we're not sure exactly what's going to happen at that station. There may be, later on we decide we want to, add to the size of the bay or something like that. It just doesn't make sense this time. Stepney Station number 1 did have a temporary fix completed earlier. They have a drainage issue that needs to be evaluated as well, but there's no urgent need there currently because of the temporary fix that Public Works did earlier. And in Stevenson Station number 2, again, speaking with the fire officers and with Mr. Nowacki, this is one that we feel we can delay. It is needed there, but there's no urgent need at this time. The next one is the ambulance replacement. This was originally in the plan for $204,000, the original bond for $204,000, and the recommendation is that we do not bond for it at this time. This is a scheduled replacement, part of the rolling vehicle replacement program, similar to what we'd like to migrate to for the fire service, which is, again, part of that study that we'll be doing. So we're not doing large replacements as we've had to do in years past with ambulances. So we have one ambulance that is due for replacement according to the normal schedule. As you might recall, in last year's budget, we took anything that we could find that we could migrate over to bonding. At that time we did, because we thought we were getting 0 from the state, so every little bit was something we looked at. The only amount that this impacted would have been the annual contribution from the operating budget, the EMS operating budget, towards the EMS vehicle replacement committed fund balance. That's an account we put in money every year towards that. That already has $136,000 in it. So based on where we are currently with the state budget, there is funding in the capital reserve to cover the balance. And there actually are other options beyond that if that wasn't to occur. So based on where we are, the need to bond for this is not seen at this time. I also had a conversation with the Board of Finance chairman, and he had agreed with it as well. So we feel that we can pursue, even though I know we're dealing with some issues with the RFP and trying to get the dollars to be more in line with what we want to see, we feel that we can pursue this without bonding. Next is Public Works dump trucks. The recommendation here is to continue as planned, the $406,000 expenditure for 2 trucks. This is part of, again, a rolling replacement program. Will improve safety, reliability, and efficiency of the fleet, reduce breakdowns during winter storms, the same vehicles that are used for plowing. These 2 purchases will replace extremely old vehicles. I believe it's 2001 and 2002. So these are vehicles that clearly, there's, vehicles that have ongoing maintenance issues, they break down frequently, so it's time. And last but certainly not least is road reconstruction, 1.018 million. This would be the phase 5 of the road reconstruction project, and the recommendation is to pursue it as originally planned. Obviously, we want to continue our overall pavement condition index, that objective scoring system that's established by the contractor that we hired to do that evaluation. It'll allow us to continue to repave and restore our town-maintained roads and continue to address the backlog of those more costly repairs that we're trying to get ahead of, and we can continue to move more towards routine maintenance, which ultimately will lower our overall costs long-term. But if we don't continue to make this level of investment, we will not continue to proceed and get ahead of that. So that is the recommendation there. So just to summarize it, originally we were just south of the $2 million in requested bond authorizations this year. We're now closer to 1.5. And the last slide is really just to, this was, I wanted finance to provide this slide for you so you can understand how this fits within our overall bonding program or path. So you'll see over the years, going back to fiscal year 2011, we have a rolling 5-year average at the right here at this line. So you can see we are we are actually, our 5-year rolling average is lower than it has been in several years, even with this level of bonding this fiscal year. Using the guidance from the Board of Finance, we are very judicious in taking on bonding as things are also rolling off. So the intent is to maintain the right balance there. And again, we are utilizing these for, again, appropriate projects that have a lifespan that expand many, many years. So it is appropriate to spread those costs out over many years. So again, this bonding fits well within our plan overall, and I would anticipate, and obviously this will go to Board of Finance as well for their review, but in my casual conversations with the chairman and with our finance director, this fits well within our overall bonding appetite, and there's no concerns relative to this, impacting our financials in a negative way.
Thank you, Mr. Kellogg. I just ask that questions be, if you have any questions generally on the overall scope, I think it's appropriate now, but we have to consider each of the motions individually.
Right,
So
right.
if there are general questions, now is appropriate. Mr. Thompson?
I'd just like to commend you for the town of Monroe and the work you've done on this financials.
Thank you.
Anything else generally, Ms. Martin?
Yeah, just in general, at some point, can we have a readout on what's coming off bonding?
Sure. You can.
My Maserati.
No, I mean what price?
Oh.
Thank you.
All right, never mind.
Looking for this, just for
Anything else
this
generally?
fiscal year?
Just this
Yeah,
fiscal year?
yeah.
So just to clarify, there's nothing that will stop the operational expenditures, those coming with bonding in the foreseeable future.
I'm sorry, say that again?
There's nothing to stop or nothing that you foresee preventing the purchase of the ambulance and other, from an operational standpoint. You're taking up bonding, but capital.
Oh, yeah,
expenditure.
in review of the capital reserve and other options that we have out there, basically what we're saying is, for the ambulance, we should just go back to the original plan prior to the state, our mitigation efforts of the state budget, and just continue to fund it the way the process we would normally follow, which would be to utilize that capital reserve, supplement it if we needed to, and go from there. And then, I would certainly recommend, or I will recommend in the budget, we'll go back to that again and include an allocation in the EMS operating budget for continue to fund this reserve account for rolling ambulance replacements.
Anything else generally? All right. Mr. Keller, anything further?
No, sir.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the detailed presentation. So we will take these one at a time, starting with H is the appropriation and bond authorization of $406,000 for the purchase of the dump trucks for DPW. Mr. Keller?
I make a motion to approve the following resolution. Resolved that the resolution entitled Resolution Regarding an Appropriation and Bond Authorization of 400 dump trucks for the Department of Public Works be approved.
Motion by resolutions introduced by Mr. Lapellis. Is there a motion to waive a reading of the entitled resolution and ask that that the full text be incorporated into the minutes?
So moved.
Motion by Mr. Pellis, is there a second? Second by Mr. Condon. Is there any discussion regarding this resolution? At this time, it'd be appropriate to ask any specific questions. Any specific questions as it relates to this motion, Mr. Mauer?
You had mentioned with the ambulances and with the fire working towards getting to a rolling replacement where it's not something that we're coming up with large expenditures suddenly. Is there going to be, can we also be moving towards that with something like, well, obviously this is a need right now, something like that towards the future, where is that a possibility where it can eventually move into a non-bonding program and part of our regular budget?
We could certainly evaluate that. I think, one of the issues is with these trucks, I think they have we tend to have them for a longer lifespan than the ambulances, so it might be more appropriate to spread those costs out. We do have there is a plan to replace them on we're not in a situation like we were with the fire service where nothing was done for such a long period of time that we had multiple vehicles all needing to be replaced at one time. So we're not in that kind of a situation. We're trying to do this, in a scheduled fashion. Whether or not it would be appropriate to allocate operational dollars and put them aside every year towards this, I could certainly bring that up with Board of Finance and Finance to evaluate that. I'm not sure if it, again, because of the different lifespan of the vehicle, if that would make sense or be appropriate, but it's an interesting concept. We can look into it. I don't know if Mr. Podofsky has any thoughts off the top of his head. I don't want to put him on the spot, but.
I think that'd be real hard to build into the operating.
Yeah, just because of the dollar amount. Yeah, it's a larger nut too, yeah.
And also, the two trucks that these are going to be replacing, are there any plans for what will happen with those two trucks? Do they have any revenue that they could bring back through sale?
Our process we've been moving towards, and I'll look towards the DPW folks here, is we have a arrangement with what is it? Gov Deals, thank you, I couldn't remember. Gov Deals is basically, think of it as eBay for government, but the difference is we don't pay the fees. Whoever bids on it pays all the fees relative to the auction. So we basically put it up and we'll get whatever, the best price we can out of it. Typically, I understand it's not uncommon for it to perhaps go to operations where maybe are less intensive than what we use. So they certainly do have some residual value, but it would probably be a less, someone who would have a need for it for less intense operations. If you want to elaborate that, feel free.
Well, correct. Working with Gov Deals, we have the opportunity to reach out to a much larger marketplace to try to dispose of surplus goods. And typically that...
Can your name,
I'm
please?
sorry, Chris
So
Nowacki.
people here, not everybody knows who you are, sir.
Apologize, Chris Nowacki, Director of Public Works. In using Gov Deals, we can reach out to a larger marketplace. And we have a better ability to receive the maximum amount of funds relevant to that piece of equipment, typically around anywhere from $3,000 to $5,000, depending upon the age and deterioration position of the vehicle. So that's what we do, and offer up to other departments as well.
And those funds will go into the general fund.
Thank you.
Mr. Orr?
The bidding price, is it just open-ended bidding, or is there a certain value affixed to the specific units? Is there a minimum value threshold?
There is, correct. There is a reserve that we set up prior to try to maximize our efforts.
Anything else? All right, so let's get this procedure right. So we have on the table the motion to waive a reading of the resolution that was made and seconded. We had a lot of discussion on the underlying issue, but let's vote. I'm going to call for a vote on the waiver of the reading of the full resolution. All those in favor? And against, that motion carries 9-0. Now may I have a motion to adopt the resolution as stated?
Make a motion.
Motion by Mr. Cohen, is there a second? Second by Ms. LaPellis. Any further discussion regarding this actual resolution for bonding for this item? All right, seeing none, I'll call for a vote. All those in favor? And against, motion carries 9-0. It requires a town meeting. I'm going to call for a town meeting on this appropriation and bond authorization for February 12th, 2018 at 7 o'clock p.m. Moving on to item I is the appropriation and bond authorization of $1,018,000 for road construction and reconstruction Phase 5 project. For introduction of that resolution, Ms. LaPallas?
I'll make a motion to approve the following resolution and have it adopted by the town of Monroe. Resolved that the resolution entitled Resolution Regarding an Appropriation and Bond Authorization of $1,018,000 for a road construction and reconstruction Phase 5 project.
Okay, resolution is introduced by Ms. LaPellis. May I have a motion to waive a reading of the entitled resolution and incorporate its full text into the minutes? Motion by Ms. Martin, is there a second? Second by Mr. Rooney. All those in favor of the waiver? And against? And may I have a motion to adopt the resolution as introduced?
So moved.
Motion by Ms. LaPellis, is there a second? Second by Mr. Condon. Any discussion on this resolution? Again, the resolution before us is the $1,018,000 bond authorization for road construction and reconstruction. Any further discussion? All right, seeing none, I'll call for a vote. All those in favor? And against, that motion carries 9-0. This bonding also requires a town meeting. I'll call for a town meeting on this resolution to be held on February 12th, 2018 at 7:15 p.m. And moving on to item J is the appropriation and bond authorization of $132,000 for the purchase of vehicles for Stevenson Volunteer Fire Department. Ms. LaPellis.
I make a motion to approve the following resolution and have it adopted by the town of Monroe. Resolved that the resolution entitled Resolution Regarding an Appropriation and Bond Authorization of $132,000 for the purchase of vehicles for the Stevenson Volunteer Fire Department.
Ms. LaPellis has introduced the resolution. May I have a motion to waive the reading of the entitled resolution and incorporate its full text into the minutes of the meeting?
So
Ms.
moved.
LaPellis, is there a second? Second by Mr. Mauer. Although, any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor of the waiver? And against, motion carries 9-0. May I have a motion to adopt the resolution as introduced?
So moved.
Motion by Ms. LaPellis, is there a second?
Second.
Second by Ms. Martin. Any discussion regarding this resolution for $132,000 for the purchase of vehicles for Stevenson Volunteer Fire? Ms. Aguilar.
Actually, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Kellogg, I don't have a question about the resolution. I have a question about, is it a possibility, and maybe this goes to the audience, that we can get how old EMS and fire vehicles are and their replacement schedule, like the schedule from the last maybe 5 or 8 years that we have replaced and what needs to, so that we can have a rolling, something visual that we can see that we've replaced fire here and this is where we need to replace it again, something that we can.
Yep, both departments have that information. The fire service actually presented that as part of the fire apparatus replacement plan, so we
Okay.
can pull that out and update it, and I know EMS has that information as well, so we can get you up for the next meeting.
Okay, fabulous. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Any further discussion? All right, seeing none, I'll call for a vote. All those in favor? And against, motion carries 9-0. This bonding authorization also requires a town meeting. I'll call for a town meeting on February 12th PM. Of course, all meetings, town meeting will be held in the council chambers and will be appropriately noticed by publication and otherwise. As everybody knows, those bonding authorizations also require approval prior to the town meeting of the Board of Finance, and my understanding is that the Board of Finance will take those up at its next meeting, correct?
Yes, we're going to add it to the Board of Finance, ask that the chairman add it to the Board of Finance agenda. I will give him the same presentation I gave you, and presumably, both concur, we'll be moving right along.
Thank you very much. Second, public participation. Mr. Kirsch?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Steve Kirsch, 35 Applegate Lane. A question actually through you to the first selectman. Is there someplace this presentation, as well as your report tonight, will be posted online for the citizens to be able to see?
Normal things that aren't ready until the night of the, after the packets have gone up, we post later on to that same.
They'll be added to the packet?
So they'll be added to the packet.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Anybody else like to participate in second public participation? All right, seeing none, I'll close second public participation. Motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Motion by Ms. LaBellis. Is there a second? Second by Mr. Condon. All those in favor? Motion carries 9-0. Good night. Drive safe. Thank you.